It's so nice to be here. This is my third time to Canberra, actually. It's my first visit for quite a while. And it's my first visit since I went to the dark side, right? Like from being a civil servant to being, a journo, right? Like, and so what I hope that you might, one of the things that I hope that you might take from today's session, actually, is that the skills and work that we developed at ONS translate very, very well into this environment now, right? Like, and these worlds are becoming much closer together than they ever were. And so I now find myself Data Visualization Editor at a newspaper, which is a curious thing because I'm the first ever Data Visualization Editor at the Financial Times. This is a new thing. It's a new role. And I thought I probably ought to explain a little bit to start with, just like what is the Financial Times? Normally I have to explain to people, no, Rupert Murdoch doesn't own the Financial Times, because people get it confused with the Times. But I do need to explain that we kind of think of ourselves as a global newspaper. We don't think of ourselves as a UK newspaper. Over half of our readership is abroad. We have bureaus all over the world and 3 principal newsrooms, the main one being in London, where I'm based, but also New York and Hong Kong, which allows us to keep the 24-hour news cycle going. So I'm the first ever Data Visualization Editor, and the first clue that they needed one probably was with the first edition. So this is 1888. This is the first ever issue of the Financial Times when it was called the London Financial Guide. And yeah, you can see it's pretty intense, right? But I'd like to point out that there's data all over that front page, right? I think data has always been a part of the Financial Times. And so as you roll forward through the FT's history, something fairly consistent starts to stand out. So this is 1888. This is 1901. 1931. Can you see the pattern yet? Yes. Yeah, 1951. And then something extraordinary happened in 1955. Right? Like, if you can see, someone thought, let's put some data in visual form on the front page. And then, as happens with a lot of organizations who start to explore this space, you can kind of overcompensate for previously not doing much of it, right? I think we were probably the only newspaper that decided to illustrate the landing of men on the moon with a Monty Python-esque photo montage. And these outsized astronauts, like, moon is a lot smaller than we thought, right? Like, and then from there, it was a real slippery slope, particularly as far as data visualization is concerned. Just brace yourselves. And this is 1999. This is getting much more recent, okay? And I like to think of these as the testicular pie charts, right? Like that's kind of, the power of graphics to surprise people. It's certainly the closest I think we've ever come to putting a penis in the Financial Times. The interesting thing with that graphic is, what was the story again? Right? Like, what are we doing this for? Right? What I find with graphics like this is it's the sort of thing that people descend into when they want to create an impact. Right? Like they want to engage. We want to create an impact, and a big part of what I'm going to talk about today is that I don't think you need to put pie charts in a pair of underpants to create impact, right? Like if you are confident that your data is valuable and has a real purpose to people knowing more about it, then that itself can create impact. And so my example of that, of what that might look like, was fairly soon after joining the FT, I did some work with one of our Washington correspondents looking at changes in US US income distribution with some data being produced by Pew Research Center. And I looked at the data, and it was very interesting data because what they've done is they've produced time series of household income, inflation adjusted, which allowed us to produce this histogram. So this is distribution of household income in 2014 dollars as it was in 1971. And you can see that, you know, the US middle class, and they define middle class purely in terms of income, actually had quite a defined shape to it, right? Like it was a discrete thing. And so to deal with the time series, I just produced a simple animation with it. And let's just have a look at that animation, how this chart changes over time. So I'm going to run a little line across the chart to allow us to remember where we started from. And then we'll animate the data through it. Financial crisis hits. And so the story here, I mean, in some ways this is quite a neutral chart, right? Like it's not saying this is good or bad. It's just saying look at this change in shape, okay? But it's quite clear that there's been a flattening out in that distribution. It's being stretched at either end, and the way that some elements of the distribution reacted to the financial crisis is quite interesting as well. So we wrote a story which was basically a story written around this transformation in the US income distribution. And it's quite nice to do it that way round, right? Like the traditional journalistic model is a real journalist writes 1,000 words and then thinks about how can we brighten that up with a few pictures. This way of doing things is very interesting, and it's the way that I think when I talk about organizations becoming closer together, it's a much more relatable situation for a stats office. Like, analyze the data, visualize it, and then write about what you find. Right? Like, that seems to me to be a really nice way of doing things. The thing that surprised me is that this chart developed a life of its own. Okay, and I'm just going to step you through it. The first thing that happened to it, I mean, this was a long time ago. It seems like decades, but it was a couple of years ago when Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were facing off for the Democratic nomination. And so income inequality was a big debating point in that runoff. So much so that the Los Angeles Times decided to write their own article about my chart. And I didn't think that that was a thing that journalists did, but turns out it is. And it was very nice of them because they were very complimentary about the chart. They said it was produced by the Financial Times, full citation, but then they wrote their own story about it, which I thought was a really fascinating thing to happen. Because, as you can see from the master image of the story, there's Bernie. There was this whole talk about how Bernie's campaign was focusing on this income inequality issue, so much so that Bernie himself put it on his Facebook page. And you can see from the reaction here, you and 22,000 others have kind of responded to this Facebook post. You started to get this enormous discussion and debate going about really, is that chart a good thing for America or not? Because there were lots of people arguing the shift to the right meant that households were getting richer, which is a good thing, right? And then other people were saying, yeah, but look at the people being left behind. And so this whole discussion started off, and this chart keeps coming back to me. I keep kind of getting postcards from it almost. Most recently, when a now deleted North Korean Twitter account of the foreign minister tweeted it at Donald Trump and the Fox News homosexuals. So, in some ways, that made me set up much more than a pair of pie charts in a pair of underpants, right? Like, there's nothing sensationalist about that chart other than look at the dramatic change in the data over that time period. And I think there's a lot to learn from that in terms of thinking about what you count as engagement. For me, engagement is people talking about the data, not the way that you've decorated it. Right? Like that's the most important thing. That allows us to go back to this point then of thinking, well, what's the purpose of all of this stuff? Why do we visualize data in the first place? If you've come here thinking that we visualize it because, reading a lot of words in one go is boring, and we need to break up layouts, that's exactly what I've been fighting against at the FT for the last couple of years in terms of our data visualization strategy. And to kind of relate what is the purpose of this stuff, I go right back to the beginning, to the person who really invented this stuff, and who opened up his book by writing these words. As knowledge increases and transactions multiply, it becomes more and more desirable to abbreviate and facilitate the modes of conveying information from one person to another and from one individual to many. It's a profound statement, that, and it's almost like a statement about big data, I think, right? Like it's almost like more and more data. We've got to focus on how we're communicating that to people, okay? The person who wrote those words was someone called William Playfair. He's a Scottish economist, an engineer, and spy, actually. In the Enlightenment, he was involved in storming the Bastille, and he invented pie charts. And I already think his LinkedIn profile would be one of the best. Right? There's a biography of this guy out at the moment, and it's well worth a read. He was a real character. What he did, though, was produce graphics like this. And they're so profound an invention, I think, it's quite difficult to think of a time when these didn't exist. Like what were people doing before these arrived? Right? And what they had was big empirical tables of data. Right? And he came along and produced these charts. Now, I still think that these charts are better than most charts that you'll see in a newspaper today, actually. Mainly because he decided not to use Microsoft Excel for some reason, I don't know why. But all of the care and attention in the design of this chart, I mean, firstly, I don't really need to teach you how to read it, right? The fundamental design of this chart has remained unchanged over the years. It's a line chart, time series. But there's some real care and attention here. If I were to say to you how many series of data are on each chart there, what would you say? 2. We've got some imports and exports. But look at the shading and the labels that explain what it means when the red line is above the yellow line. And by doing that, you actually introduce a third variable, which is the balance, right? Like the trade balance is there, right? So, and there's no separate key. All of the lines are directly labeled to allow you to read it cleanly and clearly. It's a beautiful thing. Just as beautiful as what he wrote to explain why these work. And what he wrote about these inventions of his was that he didn't say this is a great way to break up a page. What he said was these are so entirely functional because what they do is they allow you to communicate proportion, progression, and quantity in one act of memory, right? And I can prove that to you right now because if you've got a pad in front of you, I could ask you to draw from memory the changing shape of that US income distribution. And I think you'd do it. If you had to explain to someone tonight in a bar what's happened to US income distribution, I mean, obviously that might be quite a dry topic to open up with. But let's just imagine that. You could get a napkin and you could virtually recreate that chart, right? Crucially, by remembering the shape of it, right? And what the shape of it captures is the relationship between the numbers. What you're not doing is communicating the numbers. You're communicating the relationships between the numbers. That's what he was saying, and that's why this stuff is so powerful. And I still use Playfair's approach a lot at the FT. Like this is over 200 years after that chart, and I still think some of his techniques there were well worth following. This is a chart looking at the what's happened to the UK's growth since the EU referendum. And a lot of the things that Playfair did, I'm just copying it, kind of fairly unashamedly. Directly labeling the lines, shading in a balance, and making it very clear which line I'm expecting you to look at most clearly. You know, it's a very Playfair-esque chart, that. It's a very good recipe for producing simple charts. And certainly one of the things that I really want people to realize is that if people kind of come out with lines like this, you're doing something fundamentally wrong, right? Like, charts should be things of wonder, right? I think the most valuable thing in my job title is the word editor. When I first arrived at the FT, a reporter came up to me and said, "Oh, you're going to love my latest piece. It's got 10 charts in it." And I said, well, maybe, but maybe not, because actually, if you produce a chart, it's going to have to be functional. But yeah, like, a chart should be something that really creates its own, it should be its own story, right? Like, it can't, if you go back to Playfair and think, am I doing with this chart? It's just saying, here's some numbers, right? Like, that's not what you should be doing, right? Like, charts should be there for a purpose. They should be, think of them as tools of communication rather than tools of dissemination. When I worked in official statistics, I actually grew to hate the word dissemination, right? Because its etymology is largely agricultural. The kind of imagery is of a farmer throwing seeds into the field, not really worrying too much about where they land, but just hopeful at some stage that some shoots will appear or something. I much prefer the concept of communication, right? Like, which is something much more targeted and much more focused. Okay, and so charts should play their role in it. A few years ago, received an invite from UNESCO to visit them in Bangkok to review a whole series of reports that they had produced on their end-of-decade reports on access to education. This is one of them, and this will be familiar to you guys, I think, this sort of report. 40 pages of PDF, which the moment you print it, uses up all the red ink in your printer. You know, but it's also full of charts, right, this report, and it's full of charts that look a bit like this. This is the famous chart, the Figure 7 Gender Parity Index of the Adjusted Net Intake Rate in Primary Education, comma, 2009. And, you know, there's some important data in this report on an important topic, you know, access to education, primary level. So I'm going to let you read this chart and learn. Right, you're going to be the informed reader. Okay. You're going to have a drink of water while you're learning. So how's it going? What have you learned? Okay, so even for a fairly educated crowd, educated and handsome and well-dressed, this is quite difficult to engage with. It's not very clear what the purpose of the chart is, and even worse than that, it breaks for me what is the first rule of data visualization, which is that it's not standalone. You can't really fully understand what this is showing you unless you read the rest of the report. Because you might hazard a guess of what the gender parity index is, but you know, you shouldn't really rely on the readers hazarding a guess. And what about that mysterious grey shaded area in the middle of the chart? What on earth is that? What do you think? What is that shaded area? Printing error. A printing error. Yeah, like that's a good option. That's natural cynicism when reading charts is a valuable thing. So I mean, the rule is here. It's difficult to be sure what the chart is saying, and that's a pity because this data is really interesting. And so I said to UNESCO, "Would you like us to step through a rework of this chart?" And they said, "Oh yeah, that would be really good." I said, "Right. The first thing," and I saw some of you doing this when you were looking at it, the first thing is if you require your readers to do this, then you've probably not quite optimized the design. So I said, right, the first thing that we should really do here is just turn it that way up, okay, so people can read the labels. And then we just look at this chart here now. Why does the axis with the values go from 0.82 to 1.12? Why do you think? It's a very close, yeah, it's a software default. And I spoke to the person who made this chart, and they said, yeah, it's the software default. It looked at the, software looks at the range of values and says, there you go. And I have to say, in my experience, sometimes people are very happy to let the software decide it for them. Why? It's easy, and what else? You can't be accused of manipulating it, right? So that's an impartial and unbiased scale for that data, right? That's complete rubbish, right? Like the data, the software knows nothing about this data, and actually the decision to make a chart is an editorial decision. So the moment you've said, I'm going to make this chart, you actually assume some responsibility for what that chart is going to communicate. And kind of saying, I'm just going to go with the defaults so that no one can accuse, that is a complete failure of responsibility. So can anybody guess then what the value 1 refers to on the gender parity index? Parity, yeah, right, okay. So wouldn't it make much more sense to get rid of the chart and bring it back this time with all the values anchored around 1? Because we know that if you go in either direction, it means two different things, doesn't it? Yeah? So what we should do is explain that to the readers. We make it clear that 1 is our line of equality, and that in this direction more girls are enrolling in education, and in the other direction more boys. That allows us to bring back then this grey shaded area. Now, definitely not a printing error. What is the grey shaded area? Yeah, so, I mean, you could think of it, without labeling it, it's ambiguous, isn't it? Because it could be something to do maybe with error in the, data and sort of uncertainty. But in this case, it's not. This case, it's actually just the minor point of the policy target. Right? So this is really, really crucial context. So basically, any country scoring in that zone is considered to have met its policy goal. Because very few countries are going to hit 1 exactly, and this is the value that UNESCO are happy with in the middle. I'm going to bring back the titles, and it's still not a great title, but the one thing I will say is we've relegated the technical information to the footnotes. The title should be making it very, very clear what we're looking at in terms of purpose of the chart. And so gender equality in primary education, and then some technical details if people want to look up the particular statistical table. Now, what are your eyes screaming out for? Colour, right. What was the colour of the original chart? Red. Why do you think it was red? Because it was the colour of the report. That's it. Like, it's red. It's corporate red. I'm going to do it. Now, I love it when people are so slavish to corporate branding that they feel that that's the only role of colour in data visualization. I've kind of accepted at the FT that I have to at some stage put pink in my graphics, right? Like, but generally it's as a background, not because I'm going to kind of adhere to it. The thing with that bright red is it's a really saturated red colour, and I'd call it kind of like a lipstick red. Right? Not that I'm an expert on lipsticks, but it's kind of that sort of thing, right? And the one thing I do know about lipstick is that people don't put it all over their face, right? Like they don't use it in such swathes, because those bright saturated colours are actually quite difficult to look at for extended periods, and that makes them perfect for highlighting things rather than filling everything. So where should we put some bright colours on this chart? Yeah, how about let's focus on the countries that are not meeting target. There they are, right? And I'm going to use two slightly different colours because they mean very different things. And we can make it clear to the reader what that means. That these ones are where boys are disadvantaged, and those ones up there are where girls are disadvantaged. Okay? And before and after. Now, a couple of things now. The transformed chart, I would now argue, is pretty much self-contained. Right? Like, it's possible to actually understand what that data is saying and to be guided through the data by looking at the chart. That's great, not just because it makes the chart more functional in the context of the report, but it also means it can go beyond its own shore. What might you do with that chart now? Tweet it, right? Social media. It's a micro story, all of its own, right? Like, and you could be using it to really promote the rest of the report. So it could be, here's what and how much, and if you want to find out why and so what, come and read the report, right? Like that sort of thing. And secondly, just let's look at the real, we said that this first chart on the left might be, people might think, well, if I just push it through with all the defaults, it's neutral, it's unbiased, right? I'd argue it's not. I'd say it's more biased than what we've just done here, because I think the standout element of the data in this story is Pakistan. If you look on the transformed chart, it's so clear how much disadvantaged girls are in Pakistan relative to other countries. On the original, there's Pakistan. Who looked there first? No one. And if you're actually masking the real patterns in data by accepting defaults, then that's actually just as biased and partial as the thing that you're maybe trying to avoid. It's got its own biases built into it. So one of the things, I think, therefore, if we agree that these things can act as containers for stories, for data-driven stories, one of the things we really need to focus on is what we would call graphicacy, right? And that's a word that represents our ability to read and interpret visual information. Okay? And I think this is something still in its relative infancy compared to things like literacy and numeracy. I'm just going to do a quick poll. Who here is either an economist or a statistician or a research of some sort? Put your hand up. This is a good test, isn't it? How confident? Well, I work with spreadsheets. But I'd consider you a numerate crowd, right? Like, so maybe more so than if we took you to the pub tonight again, you'd probably skew the general audience in terms of numeracy and data capability, right? Because you're a carefully honed cohort of experts. How many of you have been taught how to present data as part of your academic careers? 1, 2, 3, 4, right. That's extraordinary, right? Like, that's this big gap. And I think it's a gap that has occurred in academic curricula for a couple of reasons. One of which is the distinction, the hard distinction between art and science doesn't help sometimes, right? Like, economists and statisticians largely taught how to interact with themselves, their peers, right? Like, and not much education on talking to people and presenting data to people who aren't as expert as they are. And I've worked with multiple design teams who've gone through arts education backgrounds and are petrified of data, right? Like, and then that doesn't therefore create a great breeding ground for interdisciplinary working, right? So there's a whole load of stuff in there, I think, that needs to be fixed. And so one of the things, and it applies so much to the Financial Times, right? Like, that I thought that, with all the data that we saw on those old back issues, that everybody at the FT would be data literate, and that's not necessarily the case. We've got a lot of journalists who are sensational journalists, but they are also frightened of data, and so we kind of need to educate. And so that's why one of the first things that I did at the FT was to develop this thing here, right? Very deliberately called the visual vocabulary, and the word vocabulary in particular, suggesting that designing graphics is not a random piece of intuition, right? Like that there is a grammar to data visualization. And I mean, in some senses, this is a very simplified. I'm not saying this is exhaustive, and I'm not saying it's the standard by which everyone else should be judged. We've created this around what we would expect FT readers to be able to see in the FT regularly. And one of my observations from the newsroom was we have a style guide, right, for writing. Okay? And the style guide for writing concentrates on very, very specific parts of grammatical constructs. I mean, recently, you'll be either pleased or demoralized to hear data became singular. Because, the grammar of FT writing is held up as being an important thing. It's got to be consistent, it's got to be high quality, and so the rule book says, don't swear unless you're writing in the weekend section. Right? It says the word wanker has only appeared in the FT once, and it was a misprint for banker. Misprint, right, okay. When you look in the newsroom at the visual equivalent of that style guide, it's the thing that says, use bright red, use this font. Right? Like it's all about the aesthetic decoration rather than the functional construct of the data. And so that's what this is about. This is about trying to actually take that space back and say, you can't just randomly arrive and say you want a 3D pie chart. The way that this thing works is that across the top of the poster is a whole set of relationships in data. And that's the bit that harks back to what Playfair was saying. These are the relationships in data that you really want to emphasize in your presentation of it. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can see a little bit of one corner of it. So this section here, so you've got a relationship. It explains what the relationship is, what kind of FT stories we might feature that kind of chart in, and then a range of different types of charts that can help visualize that relationship. If I just go back to the original, the UNESCO chart that we just reworked, that was all about realizing that the story, the relationship in the numbers that we were interested in using, looking at, was deviation. Deviation from equality. And if you look in the top left-hand corner, the very, very first chart type that comes up under deviation is a diverging bar chart. Right? Like, so it's not an accident that that transformation happened in the way that it did. It's like, what's the relationship? What's the underlying relationship? And then what options might there be for visualizing it? And there's so many different options under each type of relationship because these things are quite nuanced, and it's impossible to show everything at once in one image. There's always a design trade-off in, if you want to show this, you might lose this, for example, and so on. So this is a thing, and we're really keen to just share this far and wide, actually. I spent 2 months in Tokyo last year working for our Japanese parent company, and we translated it into Chinese and Japanese because it is emerging as a visual language for journalism that's very suited to internationalization. Okay? And if you want to get hold of your own copy of that, you can just download a copy of the PDF and print it off at your leisure. No FT subscription required. What we've done is put it up in the wall outside of our main news conference room where our graphics team sits, with the idea that we actually get people, this is kind of revolutionary thinking, we actually get people to stand in front of it and talk. Like it actually socializes the articulation of what we're trying to show. So a reporter will come over and say, well, look, I'm writing a story and I've got this data and I know what, and we actually get people to stand in front of it, right? Like rather than send them a kind of request form for a kiosk service or something. I want people to actually tell us what the story is. And I'm going to show you some examples of how we've adapted using that vocabulary into our graphics. Now you can see from the slightly humorous title here that this was a chart that I produced to make a point. And the reason why I produced this chart originally was to take a slight shot at the Wall Street Journal, which put a version of this chart on its front page when the Dow Jones index hit 20,000. What's the problem with this chart? No, so it's the value of the index, of the Dow Jones index. It's a linear scale, right? Like which, when you're doing an index over more than 100 years, what you're really interested in is the rate of doubling in the index. So the difference between 1,000 and 2,000 is the same as the difference between 10 and 20, right? So if you put it on a log scale, it looks like that. Right? So not only is the Wall Street crash brought right back into perspective, but in the linear one, you can see that recent events are sort of overly dramatized. Yeah, right. Like, and so it started off as this is a good example to show people when to use a log scale. But then there's something about this chart that I started to not like at all, and that is the wibbles. You can see that the chart wibbles a lot. What are the wibbles? Sorry? No, they're actually major events. They're generally recessions. Like they're things that create a big plunge in the value of the index, and there's a lot of them, as you can see, right? And the problem with this chart in its current layout is it's almost difficult. I mean, I've identified the Wall Street crash because that's more than a wibble, right? Like 25 years to recover. But wouldn't it be nice if we could actually pick out all of those other stories? And so on the visual vocabulary, you'll see that the relationship we're showing here is change over time. And what it says is the default for showing that is a line chart, right? But there are other options, and one of them is something called a vertical timeline. That's just where you just rotate it, and so the axis, the value axis, goes down on the horizontal, and you push time top to bottom. And that allows you to create a chart like this. So this is like the same chart, but just stretched out. And the idea is you can see the background shading there is every US recession. And as we then scroll down the graphic, you'll see that every single one of those wibbles you can now kind of reference. There's the Wall Street crash. There's the financial crisis, by way of comparison. And every big, tall chart needs a Trump finishing point, I think, some sort of payoff. Right? Reader reaction to this was really interesting. We had somebody write to us and said, it's like poetry. Because it was printed big and vertical in the newspaper, and they'd cut it out. They said, right, it's like a Chinese scroll. And I did think it was just a chart of the Dow Jones, right? Like it's a fairly sort of simple thing. And there are trade-offs. Like I think this is lovely if you want to drill into the history of this series, but you lose the ability to see it all in one go, for example. So it really does depend what you're trying to show. Maybe you start off with that small, simple overview one, and then you drill into this, but you're kind of aware of it. This is one of my favorites. Marcus is here today, and he and I share this concern about the prevention of cruelty to maps. So we had a banking correspondent come to us and said, we're doing a story about which European cities are vying to take over from London as the EU's financial centre after Brexit. And she'd collected a lot of data on where the banks were, right? And where a bank was, how strong it was. Did it have a fully incorporated bank? Was it just a branch of a bank or some other kind of presence? So that's what the colour represents, is the intensity of the presence, like how big a banking presence does it have. And so she said, what I'm trying to show is which cities are stronger and which ones are weaker. So let's try and process that. Can you tell that from this map? I think you probably can. I think you can probably look and say, well, Frankfurt's strong and Lisbon is weak, right? That's okay. But then she said, well, what else I want to show is which banks are already most federated. So which ones, for example, are most prepared for a range of outcomes and which ones are more committed to one or two individual cities. So how's that working? How's JP Morgan doing? Right? And now you go right back to those words of Playfair, who said, one act of memory. And suddenly you're fighting against that, because to fulfill that role, you're having to remember things and try and memorize and move on and move on and move on. And that's because the spatial relationship in this data is a bit of a red herring. It doesn't really matter how far Dublin is from Paris, does it? Right? I'm not going to use this to plan my holiday. Well, it would be a really odd holiday if I did, right? I'm going to do a tour of Credit Suisse. Going to turn up everywhere they are and get like some sort of stalker reputation. Instead, what we want to do is think of a way of bringing those two elements together. How can we show strong cities and weak cities, strong banks, weak banks? And there's a really simple way of doing that. It's just to put it on a little grid like this. And the thing with the grid that's really nice is it allows you to rank in terms of both. So on the right-hand columns are the stronger cities, on the left-hand side are the weaker cities. The top rows are the stronger banks, the rows down the bottom are the weaker banks. And so it allows you to reference that information very, very quickly. Just a point on that is, although it's relatively easy to parse, it's not the sort of graphic that someone will have seen all of the time. So there's a little how to read it at the top. Just what am I seeing? How do I read it? Right, and we're finding that's a very effective way of targeting that graphicacy element. Like, teach people how to read it. And once you've learned to read it, you'll absorb it. And the next time you see a chart like that, you can come back to it and know how to do it. Because, funnily enough, everyone here at some stage had to learn how to read a line chart and a pie chart. None of those things are intuitive. Why don't you have to relearn them? Because you learned them at primary school, probably. You know, very early on as a child, you learned how to read them. But then what we've tended to do is stop at 3 or 4 different types of chart. And recent research by Pew in the US says that 2/3 of American adults can read a scatter plot. Right? And I guess you've got 2 ways of interpreting that. One thing is you could say, oh, wow, 2/3 can read a scatter plot. And then another way you could say, oh no, like 1 in 3 people is not going to be able to understand this chart, right? Would you use words where 1 in 3 people wouldn't understand the word? I'd say, yeah, you should still push it, because I bet if you'd ran that survey 10 or 20 years ago, it would have been a much lower figure than 66%, and it's partly due to things like newspapers carrying more sophisticated graphics that's going to help win that argument. Because these graphics can get remarkably effective at showing complex relationships if you can teach people how to read them. This is one of my very favorite types of chart in some contexts. It's something called a Marimekko chart, named after the Finnish textile company, because you end up with quite patterned charts. And what this does is, as the visual vocab says, it's a good way of showing both the magnitude, the size of something, as well as the proportions of which it's made in one go. Right? So on the horizontal axis, so each row in this graphic is a country. The horizontal axis shows you what proportion of that country's GDP was the size of its banking bailout. And the shaded, the kind of hashed area, is how much of that bailout has been recovered. Okay? But the vertical axis shows you the size of the economy. So we start off with the small countries, Cyprus and Slovenia. Then you look to Greece and Ireland, and you can see they're still quite small economies, but their bailout was relatively big in terms of GDP proportion. And as you go down this graphic, you'll realize there's a fairly standout story. Which is that kind of the US breaks the chart because it recovered more money than the bailout cost. So it seems quite fitting in some ways that the US actually made a profit of bailing its banks out. And you get that sense of, as well, just how big that economy is relative to others as well. So there's a lot going on in that. And because it's a nice, big, expansive space, we can bring some text onto it that helps contextualize it. You know? So that's a nice way of working. The visual vocabulary doesn't just suggest that you work in a static space. If animations help you to show the change over time, then that's a good thing. So the sort of charts that Hans Rosling became famous for in terms of Animated bubble charts can be effective. And we can also use animation to do all sorts of other things, like looking at uncertainty in data, for example. Let's have a little look at animating confidence intervals. Might be an interesting way of showing uncertainty. There's all sorts of other things that we can do in that. One of the things that's really interesting, though, is we're aware that with the visual vocabulary, we are stretching the FT audience. We are pushing them to look at graphs that they probably haven't seen before, trying to improve their graphicacy. And we've got to be mindful that we're pushing it at the right kind of pace, right? Like, and my contention is the visual vocabulary is not an exhaustive list of every type of chart you can have. I've actually scratched quite a lot of charts off of it because I don't think they offer the FT anything that we should be kind of using regularly. But this is a good example of a complex chart type that actually does offer the FT real value. And this is something called a chord diagram. It's come out of the field of bioscience. And what a chord diagram is very, very good at showing you when you learn how to read it is it actually shows you two-way flows and net winner in one chart. So it's the sort of chart that if you were going to do it another way, you'd have to reuse multiple charts. That would be your other option. But let me try and explain it to you. The outside of this, mergers and acquisitions is a key thing for the FT to report on. We're interested in when companies buy other companies, right? And that's what we're interested in doing. And companies from across the world buy companies in other parts of the world. Okay, so there's this constant flow of buying and selling companies going on across the world. So the outer edge of this chord diagram shows, it's like a pie chart. It just shows you by continent where the proportion of deal making was. Okay, so you can see by far and away North America was the biggest deal maker. But the connections between the kind of spokes in the middle, they show you the two-way flows between regions. So what you've got here, this is the value of European acquisitions of North American companies. So this size here represents companies in the US that were acquired from Europe. And the reverse end of this shows you the other way around, the value of North American acquisitions of European companies. And because this wedge, because the US acquired more European companies than European companies acquired North American, it wins the colour. So what it basically means is this relationship here is dominant in favour of North America. Okay? So actually, once you've learned how that works, you look at China and realise all of China's flows are red because it's winning that particular exchange of companies. So we were aware that when we produced this chart for the first time that we were going to need to teach readers how to read it, which is what you get there in the top left-hand corner. But even then, we had editors saying, readers are not going to like this. And if I can tell you one liberating thing about moving from the world of official statistics to the world of journalism, undoubtedly, no competition, it's the fact that we've got comments on the website. And that can be a real cruel place to go hang out. And so it was really funny. So whenever we push something like this out, I'm really looking consciously at how FT readers are going to engage with it, what they're going to say about it. And this one went up, and sure enough, straight away, that chord diagram is horrible. Right? And what's really interesting is, like in true Facebook fashion, people can pile in and kind of like it and recommend it. And so we've got 5 people here agreeing with that commenter. You know, this chord diagram is horrible. But then, and I can tell you this wasn't my mum or anyone I knew, someone then came in and said, these charts are fantastic because they're showing this complex material. My vote for chord of the year, chart of the year, and this guy's coming in at the bottom here and kind of agreeing. And what I'm looking at in particular is the ratio of the recommends here. If I can get, for every one person that hates it, 4 people that like it, then that's pushing it at the right kind of ratio, right? Like, and I'm more than happy to have a thick skin that some people are not going to like it. They'd much rather you did produce 6 or 7 charts, breaking it down using pie charts and bar charts. But I think people are subscribing to the FT for insight and depth of coverage. You know, the writing it reflects that, and so should the graphics. You know, so they shouldn't be unnecessarily complex. You know, you don't want to make these things more difficult than they should be, but you shouldn't be frightened of pushing the reader. So that's a long way of sort of saying, become confident in selecting and manipulating chart types and pairing it up to your readers and your idea of how much your readers will be able to take. Once you've done that, then you've got to go through this process of thinking about how do I turn a presentation of some numbers into a visual narrative. Okay? And I'm going to start off with a real simple chart here. And this is the sort of chart that gets produced, accepting defaults in software all the time. And it's the kind of chart that says, here's some numbers. Right? Here's the vaccination rates. Someone once told me that every chart needs to scale at 0. So that's what I'm going to do. And there it is. Okay? What do we think? It's not wrong. Right? Those are the numbers. What are we to take from that? There was a tiny decrease and then a tiny recovery, right? Pretty much. Well, now this goes back into being an editor, right? As soon as you've decided to make a graph of this data, you're kind of saying this data is important and you need to read it. And why? Because you know that there's a story in here that actually that decline in relative terms is a very important decline. And if we just scale the axis differently, that's what it looks like. And we can scale this chart not starting at 0 because it's a percent, it's a rate. And with that sort of data, it's very, very acceptable to scale it around what you would expect the regular range of that data to be. So in a developed country, we wouldn't ever expect vaccination rates to be below 50%. You know, so why have all of that space in that territory? We're using it like a lens to zoom in. And then you start to think, right, now something's starting to emerge. And when with your reader's hat on, maybe one of the things you think is this a problem just with MMR vaccinations? Would be a reasonable question to ask. So we're going to put a little bit of context on there, which is the diphtheria vaccination rate for the same period, and it's administered at the same time to children. And you can see now we've really framed the problem. We can really sort of see what's happened to those MMR vaccinations. Going back to what happened on that UNESCO chart, we can also introduce policy targets. So this is the World Health Organization policy target because this is what they recommend for sort of herd immunity. And you can see what that does is really interesting because it makes it look now like what previously looked like a really high value at the start is already quite close to that lower end of the target. And so you actually move out of that zone very, very quickly with a decrease. And then you might be thinking, well, why? What's caused that? Right? And then this is where you really need to make the jump from a producer of numbers, producer of data, to a producer of information. Right? Like that's the difference. And it was really interesting, actually, in Brisbane earlier this week, the Australian statistician said exactly that about ABS. He said, we produce so much data and comparatively little information at the moment. You know, that's the balance that's got to happen. And so here we can start to put in some annotations that explain what was going on. The fact that there was a paper published in a respected journal that suggested there was a link between MMR and autism, which was ultimately proven to be fraudulent and was effectively retracted. And the author was struck off and obviously then went to America where he's doing exactly the same thing. I left off an annotation here because this is a real art here in kind of deciding what do you really need to know. You could put loads on this and maybe overwhelm it. I kind of resisted the urge to put right at the bottom of the V, people realised it was bullshit, right? But because I kind of thought that might come out of that anyway. And now we've got a much more functional chart. It's still not, for me, quite complete, though, because what nagging question might you still have? Why do we vaccinate children? to prevent them from getting these diseases, right? Like, so maybe we should look at what happened to instances of children getting those diseases, and that's what happened. Like, so the people obviously don't get measles the moment they're not vaccinated. Right? There's a lag, and you can see the lag very, very clearly in the instances of measles that England suffered consequently. And then you get to this point, and you realise that the weakest thing now about this whole graphic is the title. Because the title is that classic old, here are the numbers title. Right? Like, and I'm not saying you shouldn't tell people that this is a chart of MMR immunisation. That's important information. But increasingly, what I'm kind of moving towards doing is that's really subtitle information. Right? Like, and the way that I'd encourage people to think is that the title is your space to argue why the chart matters, or what the chart is saying, or why should I read the chart. And then the subtitle is doing the job of contextualizing the data that you're looking at. So the subtitle is telling you what the data is, what the geography, the time period, and so on. That can all come later on. And so, again, before and after, right? Like, and this is a really nice recipe to keep reapplying to your work. And for me, what it means is, when you're producing charts, fewer but better. Not every chart is capable of that transformation, because not every chart carries the same story. You know, and so you've got to decide, where should I put the effort? And that also means, that takes me on to one of my favourite things, which is the number of times I've said, people say to me, you know, it's all very well, you fancy charts, but if a chart can't be read in 5 seconds, then it's useless. Like, every chart needs to be instantly understood. And to those people, I kind of say, well, here's a chart that you can read very quickly. It's the voting results from the first round of the 2012 French presidential election. You can read that in 5 seconds and then move on to checking your Twitter feed or your email. You know, this is not going to occupy much of your time. Now, we've got 5 candidates ranked in order of how many votes they received. And because that was so quick to read, we can say to people, well, here's a second chart. This is the voting from the first round of the 2017 presidential election. Right? So that's 2 charts. You can read them in 10 seconds, and you're an expert. The problem is, this is just so superficial. Right? To make it a 5-second chart, you're leaving out real rich opportunities to inform people of the dynamics of French politics and what's happened. Like, for me, I am interested in, well, it's not the same list of candidates between 2012 and 2017. Some of them are the same, but some of them are different. So what I'd really be interested in knowing is, what happened to the people who voted for François Hollande? Who did they vote for in the next election? Well, there is a chart type deliberately designed to show that. Something called a Sankey diagram, for showing flows of votes. And what that allows you to do is to read this graphic and pick up all sorts of really interesting stories from it. So, what we've still got at the start and end of the graphic is effectively the bar charts. Right? The start and end is just the bar charts, the number of the proportion of votes. But these flows in between show us what happened to the voter flows. So you can see that Hollande's voters really split in half. Like, half of them went towards Macron, then this other half came down here towards Mélenchon and Hamon. So his vote was really spread. Whereas you look at Le Pen, and Le Pen's voters were really very loyal. Most of them came across with her. And so that takes longer than the other 2 charts to read, but it is infinitely more rewarding. And there's much more insight to be gained from it. And once you've learned how to read these Sankey diagrams, you can use them for all sorts of flow-type data. So we use this a lot, as we can see, flows of funds, flows of trade, migrants. You know, they're really effective at all of that sort of stuff. But I want people to grab a coffee and spend 2 minutes reading it rather than 5 seconds, right? Because it's rich. And then I think if there was one area where I was going to say to people, what might be the point of distinction between a stats office and a newspaper for how you tell those narratives and what you do, I would kind of largely badge it under the area of empathy. And what I mean by that is, the emotive element of looking at data. Right? Data has a slightly cold and hard reputation. Right? People sort of say, you know, cold, hard figures, you know, but it's difficult to relate human experience to those figures sometimes. And I think this really is something very much at the heart of data visualization, because someone like Edward Tufte would argue that this is one of the best graphics ever produced. This map of Napoleon's Russian campaign, it's lauded as a wonderful visualization because it shows the size of his army on the march to Moscow and on the way back, and it shows obviously it wasn't a successful campaign. You've got this temperature graph across the bottom which shows you the temperature during the retreat, which was terrible, -30. It's also a map because you've got the key rivers on there. You can see that obviously things were going on at the rivers and so on. And one of the things that always surprised me about this graphic was if you buy a data visualization textbook, you're more than likely to find this in it, right? Like it's cited as this is good data visualization. If you buy a history book of the Russian campaign, likely you're not going to see this graphic in it. Why? Anybody hazard a guess? I think it's all to do with the emotional interaction that a reader has. And instead, if you buy a history book of Napoleon's Russian campaign, let's just take a little example here. This river here is the river Berezina, was where one of the most famously awful events for the French army happened, which was that they burned all of their bridge-making equipment because it was so cold, expecting the rivers to be frozen. But then you can see from the temperature graph there was a slight thaw as they approached the Berezina. So they got to the Berezina and it wasn't frozen, it was slushy ice. And the Russian army was waiting for them, and they basically were slaughtered. Right? Like it was a real. You can see the size of the army. It's kind of about half its size that made it across the river. And if you buy a history book about that campaign, what you'll see instead is this. The kind of photojournalism of its day, I suppose, you know. But I think the emotional resonance of looking at the people in the river desperately clawing their way to get out of the river, that creates much more of an impact about what that campaign was about in a way that data can't, right? Like, and we see that a lot now. Like, you look at the refugee crisis, Syrian refugee crisis, the powerful picture of one dead child on a beach creates far more of an impact than the chart that says, well, there were 10,000. There were 20,000. These numbers can be quite difficult to relate to. So a big challenge for us, I think, certainly in the media, is how we balance that. Right, let's show the data and try and contextualize it in terms of human experience. So I've just got a graphic to show you. This is a story that a colleague of mine, Steve Bernard, worked on recently. He had got hold of a load of data about China's pollution levels and made this story, working with one of our China correspondents, about what's happened to Chinese pollution levels. And you can see the data's remarkable. You know, there's amazing kind of seasonal trends. A lot of them linked to economic, growth, activity. We've got some narrative in the video that explains what's going on. See these real spikes coming up. In the rest of the story as well, we've got lots of data. I mean, like lots of data. It's a real data-driven thing. But one of the things that was brilliant that Steve did was he realized, well, what is this story really about on the human level? Like, what impact does this pollution create on the human experience of living in China? And instead what he decided to do to complement this was right at the top of the article. Steve's ridiculously talented because not only is he a good cartographer and data visualizer, he's also a great artist, and he drew this artwork to go with it. So before you get to the data, you're instantly tuning into the human experience of what that really means. Like kind of What's the human story here? Now, I think the data visualization elements would hold up largely between an official statistics organization and a newspaper. I think that's a very common language. It's much more of a question for an NSO to decide how much do we get involved in the human story or not, right? Like, because it definitely helps to contextualize it, but it's also the thing that's starting to pull at emotional responses. And so it's a very powerful thing to be aware of, I would say. Similarly, we've known for years that the web is interactive. So like you can do all sorts of wonderful things with interaction on the web now. And certainly when I was at ONS, I used to love exploring some of the things that you could do with interactivity. In the news environment now, it's quite clear actually that interactivity is definitely a part of the toolkit, but you should start to think very, very seriously about when to use it. Because we have an interactive news team that I work very closely with at the FT, and they have a sign up in the newsroom saying interactive, right? And I've always sort of held the idea that that's not a great name for a team, because one, it's not a noun, it's an adjective. It could just as well be shiny, right? Or even better, I'd love to come in and see sexy, right? Written up, right? Like, and everywhere else, it's like companies, markets, you know, like domain, expertise, and then just shiny, right? Like, you know, I think you have to be very careful about how and when you kind of call in interactivity. And there's a great quote from a guy at the New York Times, Archie, who kind of summed it up like this: something spectacular has to happen, right? Like the old days of whizzing your mouse over a chart to get tooltips, like, doesn't work, right? Like, that's not really what people are expecting, particularly in the world of touch interfaces. You've got to be very, very careful about what you're doing with interactivity. Now, I am a big fan of interactivity. One of my last projects at ONS that I did was this interactive quiz on how well do you know your area. And it allowed people to sort of have a guess at what the census said about their local area. And it surprised me how popular this became, because the interactivity kind of played on the fact that people were going to get it wrong. And we kind of used the animation to deliberately draw out, to create some sort of tension between your guess and what the real answer is. And it was great, because I saw people playing with this, and there were grown adults fist pumping, right, when they got it right. Like, there was a real sense of drama in kind of how it worked. So much so that it brought the website down, which was one of my true goals of my time as a civil servant. And not only did it bring the website down due to demand, right, but if you look at this screenshot, that was at 9:45 at night, because this thing had appeared in people's Facebook feeds and so on. It had taken it into a world where ONS data doesn't normally go. And one of the reasons for that is that the media had played its role in promoting it, right? Like, you know, statistics.gov is like, that's two of people's least favorite words in a URL. So getting the media to help you tell that story is really, really important, because those are the places that people are going to go for that kind of content. And at that time, I loved what happened with the quiz, actually, because the Guardian phoned me up on the morning and said, can we put a link to your quiz on our homepage? And I was ecstatic. I was like, yeah, great, that will really drive the traffic. But what happened was that the rest of the day's news really helped us out, because England were playing India in a cricket match, and in the morning, you can see on the website, it said, can England score the runs to claim a famous victory, right? 3 hours later, Cook was vowing to stay on as captain because England had collapsed, right? And instead, look what they decided to put as poll page on the website. There's suddenly, oh yeah, census quiz, right? Like, that's what our readers really want to read about. And that sort of thing was replicated across, because it was a local quiz, local newspapers took it as well. So it was really federated very, very well, and that was kind of played a large part of it. So kind of distilling that, I think the recipe that we sort of used there on that was that if you're going to use interactivity, make it visual, personal, and social. That's what happened with that quiz, right? Like, there was a visual element to it. The interaction was all about knowing, where do you live, so I can customize this content for you. And then the social element was that now you've got a score, compare your score with your friends, and that kind of really helped kind of promote it. At the FT, I haven't really been involved in too many interactive projects, partly because they are actually so expensive to make relative to other types of content, and you've really got to think very carefully about the reader experience for that. But one of the things that we did recently was we got hold of a load of open data from the industry telecoms regulator, Ofcom. They gave us 1.5 million postcodes worth of broadband download speeds, and we linked that to 2.5 million building polygons from the National Mapping Agency. We analysed the data by looking at things like levels of deprivation, urban, rural, looking at all kinds of things, a very rich data set. And what we found was a story where, well, we found lots of stories, right? Like, but here's the overall histogram of download speeds in Britain. And one of the things that was interesting about it is we traditionally assume that rural areas are much slower than urban areas, and that didn't necessarily seem to be the case. We actually had areas of London, central London, with very low broadband speeds, and we actually found, do you want to see where the fastest internet in the whole of Britain is? We made an interactive map, all right? And so what I'm going to do, I hope this works, we've got some pre-selected stories in this interactive, so these are things that we've reported on. And the fastest internet in the country, get ready, we're not in London, slight performance lag on this computer, unfortunately. Right. Anybody notice anything about these fast areas? Right. It's completely rural. It's farmers. And it's farmers who've decided to lay their own network. And as soon as we found that story, we said, well, let's go off and find them and speak to them. And I love it because the woman who ran this volunteer group, Chris Conda, it's great. She says, the main benefit is not really gigabit speeds. It's the community. Most of the volunteers are 65, and they're now as fit as butcher's dogs. They've got their six-packs back, like that. And so there's this gloriously counterintuitive story, basically, that actually what had happened is that they'd laid their own full fibre network at low cost because they didn't have to replace any existing infrastructure, and they've done it for themselves. And instead, in all of the city centres, you can see here, so red, dark red is slow, the brighter colour the lighter colour is fast. You can see in all of the residential connections in city centres across Britain, the city centres are slower. It's just such an odd story, and one that's gloriously sort of counterintuitive. And that element of surprise is what makes that data into a story, right? Like, it's really, really interesting. And so you've got a mixture here of static graphics and also, right, pop in your postcode and you can see sort of how your area compares, and it will zoom you off to go and do it. So it's down here, and then it allows you to tweet out how fast the average connection is in your area and how that compares and so on. So that's that visual, personal, social thing. Crucially, linked to some human reporting, because you could imagine that a piece on broadband speeds would be really dry, right? And it actually turned into a really lovely human story, because we interviewed some of the people who were using that rural gigabit connection, and we found a teacher who had to retire because she'd got cancer, but she set up a little company on Etsy selling stuff, little homemade knitted products that she was making, and she was doing it over a gigabit internet connection dug by the local farmer next door. So it was really, really interesting to do that. I thought I'd just finish by talking about technology. Notice I haven't started by talking about technology. I love Danny Hillis. He's an American inventor, and he has got a definition of technology that is brilliant. He says technology is everything that doesn't work properly yet. So what he says is, like, no one thinks of a grand piano as a piece of technology because it just works. He said, whereas if you've got an exploding Samsung smartphone, nice piece of technology, right? Like it's everything that's not working. And so in the world of data viz, for me, it's a really difficult thing to avoid, but you really have to try and do it, to try and not see it as a technology-driven thing, right? Like see it as a technology-enabled thing. Because there's so much choice out there. I think it's probably a sign of how immature everything is at the moment. That there's, I think, now over 300 tools and resources listed on this website. There's all sorts of tools that you can use to get going on data viz. I am most suspicious of people who only swear by one tool or two tools, because that's not how this stuff becomes fun, actually. You should just learn to dip your toes into all sorts of things. I'm just going to show you very quickly, if you've not seen it before, like there's this tool here called raw graphs, right? Like, I hope we've got a connection here that will support this. So if I go to raw graphs, let me go to... so this will be a good test of technology. If it doesn't work, all we're doing is proving Danny Hillis's definition. Let me just Google it now. Anybody heard of this before? No? Okay, that's great. Am I going to be allowed to do it? Right, yeah, so rawgraphs.io, right? Like if you go to this website, it's just a free-to-use website. If you look at the visual vocabulary and think, oh my gosh, there's some lovely charts I'd love to create there, but I don't know how to create them, this sort of site's very good for doing it. So just to show you how quickly that is, I can go to raw graphs on the web, you just point your browser at it, and you can upload your data or paste your data in. I'm just going to try one of their sample data sets, right? They've got lots of different sample data sets, the most uplifting of which is the Titanic's passenger list. And you can see here it's loaded in the Titanic passenger list, so we've got every passenger on board, whether they survived or not, what class their ticket was, how old they were, and so on. And so what raw graphs allows you to do is to pick, look, from lots of different types of graphics, what are you going to do with that data? And one of the things I'm just going to do here is show you there's a type of chart called a bee swarm plot, which is good for visualizing distributions, particularly where you've got lots of values in the same space, right? Like actually that can be a thing. And all you do with this is, on the left-hand side is effectively the columns from your data. And you just drag the columns into these little containers here. So my groups in this bee swarm plot, so it's going to create a separate bee swarm plot for each individual element. I want to look at it based on whether they survived or not. Okay? I want the x-axis to be the age of the passenger. And I want, so if I go down, you can see while I'm doing this thing is building up, right? So that x-axis there is age, and each plot is showing us passengers based on whether these are the survivors up here, and these are the ones that didn't survive. And just a little bit of context that we can add in here for colour is, let's put the class of their ticket. And just drag that on there. And now the colour of ticket represents the class. The colour of the dot represents the class of the ticket. So, and you can change these if you want. So if you want to make them all lipstick red and so on, you can do that. But so the red ones here are first class. So you can see these elderly first class passengers here who survived. If we go down to the ones who didn't survive, not so many red dots, right? Like, but look at the children who didn't survive relative to the children who did. There's a big difference in the colour of the class of their ticket, right? Like, so almost like an instant insight just from dragging and dropping a little bit of data into it, and you can switch between different things. So, you know, something to play with maybe, but it's a good example of just saying, right, you don't need to go in and think, right, now can I go get my guide to data science and learn how to code and program. You can dip your toe into this stuff fairly quickly. The only other thing I was going to say is just a shameless bit of self-promotion. If you kind of like some of those makeovers I've showed you, the FT kind of liked them enough for me to get my own little column. So I try to do, I've fallen behind a bit this year because Trump keeps us busy, but in principle I'm trying to do these like once every month or so, where we actually write through the process of how we're designing our graphics and things that people can learn from and so on. So if you get yourself access to the FT, there's some interesting stuff to learn from it. Great. Thank you very much.